Hello, my name is Brittany Pires, and my project is titled Pride and Internalized Prejudice, the Hate Marginalized Communities Have for Themselves. So, what is internalized prejudice? Otherwise known as internalized oppression, T.M. Williams defines it as being a process through which members of subordinate groups are socialized to fit the needs and desires of the dominant group. It is important that we note this aspect of socialization. It is not an intrinsic belief to find a minority group to be inherently less than another group. Internalized prejudice occurs when members of an oppressed group begin believing and accepting the negative stereotypes associated with their community. These beliefs can vary widely. People may believe that their own communities are physically, intellectually, or culturally inferior to the dominant group. This variety makes the subject deeply complex, as it can emerge in vastly different ways in different individuals. So, what does it look like? Because of this complexity, it is impossible to encompass all the different presentations of internalized oppression. But there are some common signs of this mentality. Politics of respectability are, at least in theory, a form of resistance against racial mistreatment. The idea encourages people of minority races to assimilate to the dominant culture in the hopes of proving that the negative stereotypes associated with them are unfounded. While it is strongly associated with race, it can also be applied to other oppressed groups, such as those in the LGBTQ community. A belief in this method is likely a sign of internalized prejudice, as it holds the core belief that the culture and behaviors of the dominant group are superior to oppressed groups. Notably, it also places the onus of eliminating discrimination on the victims of it rather than on the perpetrators. Undervaluing cultural or physical traits that are related to one marginalized community is also a sign of internalized oppression. Practices such as skin lightening, the degradation of African American vernacular English, the often cruel dismissal of gay men who behave in more feminine ways, and the policing of trans identities and appearances, particularly policing that encourages this community to match a cis heteronormative society, are all examples of this undervaluing. Finally, justifying the mistreatment of one's own group, essentially making excuses for discrimination and poor treatment, is another rather common sign. The examples I give are saying she was asking for it, he was resisting arrest, she shouldn't have gone in that bathroom. These all apply to different groups. The first one is typically women, and it is a way of victim blaming them for sexual assault or rape. The second is usually in regards to people of color, especially those who are of darker skin tones, and it is in reference to justifying police brutality. And the last one is she shouldn't have gone in that bathroom. I usually see this in relation to the trans community, typically trans women, although they don't use the correct pronouns, and it is an explanation for the abuse they suffer when they try to use the bathroom that matches their actual gender identity. So what are the causes? In a sociological work written by Dr. Karen Pike, she explains that people who face racial discrimination are also done a great deal of psychic damage in the process. When a person is bombarded by, perhaps subliminal messages that all point to their race as being less valued than another, it is exceedingly difficult not to internalize that. Furthermore, Pike also tells a story in which she was approached and admonished by two other researchers, as they felt it was more pivotal to tell stories of resistance than to address internalized oppression. It is also possible that this mentality is a conscious or subconscious effort to protect oneself. A person with internalized prejudice may view themselves as an exception to the rule, a belief that may allow them to shield themselves from racist, homophobic, or transphobic messages. On the flip side, if they do not believe themselves an exception, there may be a sense of comfort when one fails a task if they believe they are inherently inferior. Of course, that is not to say that internalized prejudice does not cause mental anguish, which brings me to my next point. What are the effects? Christine Molina and Drexler James state in their research that being Black in America is being met with high levels of racism, which can have vast implications for a group for whom depression is most severe and debilitating, and whom already bear the brunt of persistent health disparities. It is difficult to describe the despair one must feel when they are already being attacked from all angles externally, and they begin attacking themselves internally as well. Perhaps a more insidious, and certainly a less individual effect, is that internalized prejudice helps to maintain the current system of inequality and oppression. As I stated previously, politics of respectability place the onus of eliminating racism on the racially oppressed, exonerating the oppressors of all culpability. This also ties into the mental strain this can cause a person, as they will often attempt to distance themselves from the negative stereotype. Speaking from experience, it is suffocating to feel like you must represent your entire race, that any mistake you make will shed an unsavory light on an entire demographic of people. Trying to distance yourself from that demographic while knowing that it will always be the first thing people see when they look at you must be difficult as well. Finally, internalized oppression also serves to increase assimilation, as people reject minority cultures in favor of the culture of the majority. This obviously can result in losing cultural practices of marginalized communities while still keeping them in their marginalized position. Are there any solutions? Short answer, not exactly. People can experience internalized prejudice in a large variety of different ways and to different levels of severity. Furthermore, there's also the fact that many people do not see these views as a problem, but instead simply as a statement of fact. Because of the sheer complexity of this issue, there is no one size fits all answer. However, I would go on to state that this is rather typical of any problem that is societal in nature. There was always the simple solution of change the way society is run so this issue stops self replicating. But obviously, that is much easier said than done. Unlearning internalized prejudice is a difficult and lifelong process. The first step is admitting that what one is experiencing is internalized prejudice. And the next step is internally checking these biases. It is not easy to have to constantly correct yourself, to forcibly engage the deliberate mind in an effort to silence the automatic mind. It's tiring. And when one only has so much mental and emotional energy in a day, it can definitely seem easier to just let sleeping dogs lie. People who attempt this and struggle with it also might question why are they even attempting it at all? If their life was fine before, why should they need to change anything? I believe a key part of recovering from anything, but especially unhealthy coping methods or unhealthy mentalities, is in starting small and giving oneself room to grow. Think of one bias that you have against your own race and focus on correcting that whenever it comes to mind. It will be less exhausting than trying to correct everything at once, and it will also allow your mind to eventually make connections and make these corrections on its own. If I force myself to stop thinking of my race as lazy, if I recognize that this is a baseless generalization, then eventually I will realize that my other prejudice ideas are also baseless. Finally, it is important to forgive yourself. Sliding back is common in progress, and it is okay to fall back into generalizations that you are making an active effort to change. Take a deep breath, acknowledge that you made a mistake, and try again when you have the energy. Are there any preemptive measures? Yes and no. We cannot fully control our socialization and the ideas that we are fed through our families, peers, and media sources. However, as Pike says in her study, to forge effective methods of resistance, it is necessary to understand how oppression is internalized and reproduced. All systems of inequality are maintained and reproduced in part through their internalization by the oppressed. To fix a problem, we have to be aware of it. So the first preemptive measure is always education and knowledge on the subject. This means addressing the topic instead of ignoring it, encouraging diversity and more access to mental health help. Children of color will grow up with a different idea of their race if they are not exposed primarily to stereotypical depictions of it. And in discussions regarding oppression, it is important to address the ways in which it is upheld, even by people of marginalized communities. Karen Pike mentioned earlier that her associates encouraged her to not pay attention to the fact that people have internalized oppression and to instead focus on the ways in which they are fighting against oppression. That said, we cannot focus only on the highs of resistance. We have to look at the lows if we are ever going to pull them up with us. And in discussions regarding oppression, it is important to address the ways in which it is upheld, even by people of marginalized communities. At the core of resistance is the idea of struggle. We will get nowhere by denying the struggles we have. So for my closing thoughts, I just wanted to share some statements. The first one is, it is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. And then the second one is shedding light on psychological processes that lead both anti-transgender discrimination to affect mental health and protective factors to alleviate the negative effect of stigma on mental health. This first quote, it states that we are always looking at ourselves through the eyes of a society that presents us as other. This is not our fault, but the healing is our responsibility. And the second quote says, I just want to focus on the idea of protective factors for this quote actually. Community, confidence, and solidarity. These are things that we lose when we experience and give in to an internalized prejudice. But they can be regained and they can be strengthened. And we all deserve to live in a world that makes us feel safe and comfortable. Thank you guys for listening.